From Silicon Valley, the heart of startup land, it's Getting to Alpha, the show about creating innovative, compelling experiences that people love. And now, here's your host, game designer, entrepreneur, and startup coach, Amy Jo Kim.
Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Today, we're talking with Tony Stubblebine, a product creator and entrepreneur who got his start working at Odeo and then Twitter. Tony now runs an innovative training and education company called Coach.me. He has a unique perspective on finding product market fit and a long history of following his nose into whatever is new, hot, and exciting in tech.
Probably the best thing I ever did for myself was throw away the last company so that I could work on something where spending 5 years trying to figure it out, it didn't feel like an opportunity cost to me because I was just so completely enamored with this space.
Listen in and learn about what's on Tony's radar these days and why he thinks Nanodegrees might just be the future of online education. Welcome, Tony, to the Getting to Alpha podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful that you're here. So for those who don't know a lot about you, why don't you start with a whirlwind tour of your background? Tell us how you got started in design and tech, and also how you decided what to pursue along the way.
Sure. I'll try and give the quick summary. I think the thing that when I give the summary, the kind of the overall message that I like to give is that there's a career progression, almost like a ladder, where I went from a know-nothing kind of peon engineer to a CEO and product designer. Because I run into people all the time that think, well, like, you know, how can I start a company tomorrow? And I think I can answer half of that question. How can you start a company? But the tomorrow part always trips me up. And so I'm a big believer in this phrase, you know, it takes 10 years to become an overnight success, that a lot of the work is in the prep. And where I started was just, you know, this sort of stereotypical nerd with a computer who got really excited by programming anything. And so I taught myself to program. I went to college and got a computer science degree. And when I graduated, I just took whatever job was willing to hire me. And I ended up doing really kind of boring, trivial work for a large corporation. And that, I think, that's where the rest of my career trajectory changed, is because I learned very early on that I don't actually like leisure or boredom. I think, you know, young high school me would have been surprised by this. All I wanted was to not have to do schoolwork and have as much free time as I wanted. So, but when I got into work, I learned that actually I want to be challenged and I want to have an impact on my life, on the world. And so I went from that boring, trivial job to a company called O'Reilly, which is a big tech media company. That introduced me to the world of startups. I worked for a company called Odeo, which is most famously the company that Twitter was spun out of. And I worked there as an engineering manager. And it kind of, as I was watching Odeo implode, except for this side project called Twitter, I came to this conclusion that maybe the impact of my work would matter more if I had more control of it. And that's when I started doing product design. And I went out on my own and started a company called Crowdvine, which was a bootstrapped social networking company. I think because I was a very novice product designer, I built something that, you know, I knew what a social network should look like because I was seeing other social networks. I was seeing MySpace and Friendster and Facebook. And so it wasn't too creative, but it was enough to get my feet wet. And I ended up building a business there that was profitable the whole way through, building tools for conferences. And about year 4, it had gotten to the point where I didn't have to work too hard on it. And I started to do some self-reflection. And the main self-reflection that I had was, why on earth did I build this particular company? That, you know, it's like I didn't want to be the world's expert in conferences, and yet I built software that primarily served conferences. And so that self-reflection made me really think, well, what do I care about? And the thing that I care about is performance. I like it in sports. I like it in programming. I like it in entrepreneurship. Recently I've gotten into watching the Great British Baking Show. And so I'm into like, how do you perform at a high level as a baker? It really doesn't matter. It's that sort of that underlying pursuit of excellence that I find that I'm always curious about. And so that led me to start the company I'm working on now, which was originally named Lyft, but is now named Coach.me.
Tell us about how Lyft evolved into Coach.me, because that's a really interesting story. And I think makes the point about you following what you're interested in, as well as your evolution as a product designer and a product manager.
Yeah, we had a bunch of pivots along the way, and I'm one of the people that is a stickler for the correct definition of a pivot. A lot of times people say that they pivoted when they really mean that they've rebooted or restarted. It's like if you start out building a photo sharing app and then build a game inside of a messaging platform and then end up doing a Bitcoin startup, those aren't three pivots. Those are three completely different ideas. What we did, though, is we had probably four pivots that were all along the same basic idea. How can we help people become superhuman? How can we help them perform at their best? And the first idea was very gamified. The second idea was more social. The third idea was to move from the web to mobile, which really like clarified the product. And then after a couple of years of really failing to build a large following and goal tracking. I mean, by the way, large following now is like you have like 50. If you can't get to 50 million users, then you don't have a large following. And we had a good following, but not that venture scale kind of following. That we made one more pivot, which was to come into coaching and make coaching a really accessible form of training and education. And that's what we did at the beginning of 2015. And that's what we've been working on ever since. And so I got asked this pretty regularly, like, what did I learn from the Lyft days? And the things that I feel like as an entrepreneur that I wouldn't do again is Lyft was so speculative. Like, wouldn't it be cool if this thing existed and everyone used it? But we didn't have a hypothesis for how it would be a business. Like, there was no revenue hypothesis, and we didn't have a hypothesis for how we would get users. And Coach.me, when we pivoted into coaching, had a much stronger idea of how to do those two things. And I think in that way is a better business, which it matters, to the investors, but also matters to me. Like, this is the work that I want to do for the rest of my life.
As a product creator, the evolutions that you went through, that you just told us about, I think a lot of people resonate with those ideas. Gamification, social. A lot of the people that I work with come to me and they want help gamifying their app and making it more social. And yet you also found that that wasn't enough. So now that you are pivoted and you're working on this new endeavor that's got legs, right?
Right.
How has your thinking evolved around how you're incorporating social and how you're incorporating gamification?
Well, I know, Amy, this is something that we've talked about when we've had lunch, is the sort of kind of the switch from a very naive idea of gamification to, a more, I would at least say experienced. I think it just in general, when I was getting started, I was doing a lot of cargo cult product design because I didn't know any better. I didn't have any experience. I didn't have any training. So I was copying ideas that I saw that resonated with me and just testing them out. And of course, mostly they didn't work, but I always came away smarter. I think you have a much more nuanced take of why gamification works and doesn't work in particular verticals. But I only have it from my own vertical, the sort of the self-improvement vertical. And I think very, raw gamification doesn't work in this vertical because it competes with a pre-existing fantasy. So people come to our world with this fantasy of who they could be. If it's in health, they're thinking about their muscles or the definition of their and tone of their body. And so when you try and put a game on top of it, where I'm thinking about this one from early on, Epic Win, which was a gamified to-do list, where that game is you're collecting gold coins for going to the gym so that you can buy gear for your avatar dwarf. Like, that's a second fantasy. It competes with this other more powerful fantasy of who you could become. And so what we found when we made the switch from gamification to social was that it allowed us to keep the pre-existing fantasy that was motivating all the behavior, and then use tactics that maybe exist in a game, but there's corollaries in social, like to get in Facebook when someone likes you, right? Like that's a positive reinforcer, but it also has a social component of it. And so as we built Coach Dummy, it's absolutely there's milestones, but they're all milestones that are based on something that happened in reality.
Something that happened in reality, meaning they're tied into your external world goals?
Yes, absolutely. So you don't get a milestone for you accumulated 50,000 points, and there's no like weird currency system like that. You get a milestone for, hey, you're on a 300-day streak of inbox zero. When you think about it, a 300-day streak of inbox zero is a lot of clearing your inbox and being organized. There is some real value to that is much closer to people's fantasy of being highly productive person.
It's great that you're reflecting on, the mistakes you made and then what you learned from them. I think you are very known in the entrepreneurial community, at least in my entrepreneurial community. And you talk to quite a few people. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see entrepreneurs make about how they're approaching their product development in your world, in your network?
Yeah, I mean, especially as we've gotten into coaching, we're now more likely to be coaching young entrepreneurs too, or not. Young isn't important. It's the first time or early on. The thing that is really standing out to me is that people are planning too far ahead. It's like they're stuck by this idea of what the company could be 5 years from now, and they're trying to make the 5-year version of the company happen tomorrow, rather than realizing that if you have no customers, the next milestone is one customer. And that's advice that I've seen recently that is actually, I found it to be very helpful because it's unblocking. And as we coach, we've found a very powerful tactic is to help people with momentum. And so for entrepreneurs, a lot of the mistakes they make are really blocking them from making real progress. So there's two ways to be blocked from making real progress. The one is paralysis by analysis. You're overthinking it. And so you can't, you think, well, I can't start this company unless I have investors. Well, that's always bullshit, right? That there's always a smaller version of the company that you could build in evening and weekends that doesn't require any investors or even for you to give up your job. I sent an email out about the product to all my friends, I tweeted about it and no one responded. It's like, well, what do your friends think about it? What does your spouse think about it? What do you think about it? Where could you get that first user before you try and go out to the public and get 1 million users? And so that's one way that people block themselves. And the other way that they block themselves is that they overbuild in secret, which is kind of a different way to not make progress, because all the progress comes from real users, real learnings, real revenue. And when you're thinking, well, I can't bring this to someone until it's done, and I might spend 3 years, getting it, to your own idea of done. What you've really done is just wasted 3 years where you could have built a smaller version and gotten out to people earlier. And so all of those things fit for me into this framework of you're obsessed with the idea of the final version of the company rather than the version that should exist tomorrow.
So it's funny, after the lean startup has permeated the culture and pretty much everybody talks the talk.
Right.
And yet there's still that trend. I see it too. I see some very sophisticated people I know playing that game. And I think it's tempting, but it's also, I think some of it ends up having to do with ego. And also sometimes if you're naive, VCs are telling you. Because often when you take VC money, they really tell you to play the 5-year game.
Right.
And part of why I've developed the Getting to Alpha programs that I run is because it's about early product design, getting you to find the small handful of early passionate customers who will get you off the ground first, warts and all. right? Which is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so I like micro focus on it. And I found so many people saying, this is contradicting what my VC said. I'm like, why don't you give it a try and see where it takes you?
To me, this is like the core contradiction of entrepreneurship. Is that all you have is contradictory information. And there's like this world of people that really want, are used to a world of black and white, and then they come into entrepreneurship, and then I think they really struggle. And I mean, everything is in balance. And, on the one hand, I can say that I'm very humble about throwing something away and restarting it. On the other hand, I had like the incredible ego to say I was going to spend, the very first version of this I built for myself in early 2010. So I've now spent 5 complete years on this, and really just now am getting to the point where it's very clear that this could be a very big company. And so, do you say you have to have ego to be an entrepreneur, or do you say you have to have humility to be an entrepreneur?
Both.
Both. And that's what makes it such a hard job.
Oh, that's really well put. I think it is a hard job, and it is full of contradictions. Do you have to actually have a 5-year vision and then micro focus on the next 3 months and 3 users? Yes. Like you have to have both in a sense.
Yes.
You can't tack the ship unless you know where you're going. But sometimes you decide to change course. But I think that is the contradiction, and it is hard. So thank you for clarifying it and adding to the, knowledge base of the real work of entrepreneurship. And it's navigating that. And that's what really good scientists do too. So the way that I approach it, and I kind of calm myself down as an entrepreneur, is to say, think like a scientist, but also like an artist. An artist is where your complete heart is in it. And you have to love it so hard to stick with it. Tony, you've stuck with this for 5 years, and you're just figuring out that it's like, this is the big business. That means your heart is deeply in it, right?
Right. Well, that's the lesson I learned from my last company to this company. Is I spent the first 3 years of the last company just thinking, I will not fail. I will not fail. I will not fail. And then I got to the point where I was like, well, hooray for me. I didn't fail. This thing is pretty profitable, and it's like an actual lifestyle business. Other people are running it while I'm just hanging out at home playing video games. Is that what I really wanted? This is hard to know. What is your mission in life? And I think if you're 25 and you don't know that, that's fine. The best way that I know to learn it is to go out there and live and experience things and try things. And probably the best thing I ever did for myself was throw away the last company so that I could work on something where spending 5 years trying to figure it out, it didn't feel like an opportunity cost to me because I was just so completely enamored with this space. And I knew that every day I spent working on it, I was helping people, maybe not at a venture scale, but always helping people. And more importantly, I was having fun and learning a lot.
Which you're now applying. So let's talk a little about how you are applying those learnings to the early testing and iteration. How do you now decide which ideas to pursue and which ones to filter out?
It's a great question. The cultural shift inside the company is that we're really learning how to double down on stuff. Before we had figured it out, what we had gotten really good at was trying stuff, trying something new, trying variations, iterations, rapid experiments. I remember we had one board meeting over the summer where a board member came into the board meeting with an idea, and then we had built a whole product around it and found enterprise customers to pay for it and gotten a month of data from those enterprise customers before the next board meeting came around. And this board member is, running a big company of his own. And he was like, his head exploded just simply because he carries around so much frustration about how hard it is to get ideas tested. So that's what we were really good at. But what we weren't good at was what to do if you get something that's really working. And so the big cultural shift is just to be willing to do less, but to do it really well. So the example that we're in right now is that we figured out the basics of coaching online. That's most of what we did last year. But what we want to use that knowledge for is to take something that traditionally you might learn from a book or a class or or a conference, and train you for that through coaching. There's a bunch of benefits to getting it from a coach. One, the coaches personalize it. So instead of getting this data dump of trivialities, you get just the information you need. And then two, it's always about applying it. And I think this is what's so wrong with so much training is you get a lot of information, but you never actually apply it. So like, as I would describe it, you'd rather get an MBA from a business coach who's helping you build your business than from leaving your business for 2 years and going back to school, right? If you could get it from a business coach, that's such a better way to learn what you need to learn. So what we've, for the last couple of months, been working on is leadership coaching, which is the first example of us taking what we knew about coaching and doing it for a very specific thing that you want to learn. And so in that, we're just trying to be as hands-on as possible about it so that we're constantly getting feedback. And even then we screw that up. When we originally launched it, we tried to have our coaches coach the first versions of it. We felt like we weren't learning fast enough. And so me and Terry on my team started taking on business clients ourselves just so that we could test how to coach it so much faster. And so that's what we're focused on is just pick one thing and don't give up on it until we have it working all the way through. And that means that the quality of the product has to be very strong. And also, in our case, we need to know how to generate leads for it and then close those leads. We need a working sales process.
One of the things you mentioned is the idea that the first idea is always wrong.
Yes.
How does that work into your process and into, your evolution? Because I love that, because I think that that's a great way to go into an experiment or go into a discussion is like, here's the idea, but let's evolve it.
Yeah. We were talking beforehand, you'd sent over some prep, and I think this is where I was thinking about how you and I come kind of from different directions a lot of times, where you have a much stronger design background and I have a much stronger engineering background. And so when I wrote down the first idea is always wrong, when I test an idea, what I'm actually wondering is, where am I going to get the second idea? And I think that's why I have a strong preference for always testing ideas through prototypes. Because there's something about, and this is also because prototypes are so cheap for me, or have traditionally been so cheap for me because I'm an engineer. It's actually easier for me to build something than for me to Photoshop it, right? And so, but I really like to have the thing in my pocket, on my phone, in my web browser that I can actually use, because as people give me feedback saying, well, I don't really like this, it's not working for me, then I just feel like by having a prototype that I can use, I'm getting more insight about what the second idea might be. Does that make sense?
Not only does it make sense, it's completely the way that I work as well. So I think if you come out of game design, prototyping is because you're building systems, basically variations on feedback systems with lots of content in them. And so you never wait a long time to get to first playable. The smart game designers do lots of early prototyping. The interesting thing is what you choose to prototype and what signals you use that go into those first prototypes.
Right.
For me, my process is get signals from your target early customer market as you're building the first prototype. Get it. You can get those signals before you've prototyped it, use it for your prototype, and I think get further. Now, it's very similar to what you're talking about. But in terms of design, one of the huge threads from our whole first season of the podcast was designer after designer after designer saying, the most common mistake I see people make is they don't prototype soon enough. So it's actually a problem in design. It's so related to what you were just talking about the 5-year plan and the 3 years in secret. And, so prototyping is just, it's oxygen.
This is where I feel really lucky in this version of the company. Someone who stuck around for a while and then ended up moving into the CTO role. Alicia is her name, and now on the board with me. So, as part of spending 5 years on a project, the team can shift a little bit. So in Coach Me, it's really Alicia is my main partner here, and she's like probably one of the most technically excellent engineers I've ever worked with, and from on every single platform, from the web to the front end to iOS to I've seen her write native Android code. But the thing that to me makes her CTO material is that she's incredibly pragmatic. And I think her default is to think the code that she's written is going to get thrown away because the product will be wrong in some way. And that's not the default mode of thinking for most engineers. The default mode of thinking is that this code will live forever and will be a maintenance nightmare and therefore needs to be over-engineered. And I find that that's a hard notion to essentially beat out of engineers. And I'm pretty firm about it, having spent a long time as an engineer myself. But that's what I think made the company work as we were doing our search, is that Alicia in particular was setting a culture of, let us build something simple and get it out in the world. And then if people like it, then we're going to double down on it and do a lot more.
So that's fantastic. The only thing I've seen can go haywire with that is if you build a bunch of spaghetti code and then don't actually refactor it.
Right.
I had some very painful experiences with that with some clients. So that's the tricky part, but you're right. The thing is, it's a stage issue. If you're figuring out your business model, your core customers, and your core revenue streams, and bringing that all to life, you don't want to be over-engineering it because it's going to change a lot.
Right.
And that's where actually a good CTO can also be, can help you do things like make sure you have an API or some of the basic things that will really help you have well-structured software.
I mean, Alicia and I talk about this a lot, how there's sort of this debate, almost this polarized idea of Facebook as a group of hackers and Google as a, world of like great engineers, and that those things are actually different. And we just think that that's false, that you can write simple, quick code that is well-formed, clean, and well-structured. There's a lot of things like because we've focused so much on doing a small thing, it actually makes doing high-quality code actually easier. There's a Edgar Dijkstra quote, who's a big computer science professor from back in the day, that roughly goes, the great programmer understands the limited size of his own brain. And so programmers are everywhere trying to make things so complicated that they can't possibly fit the solution inside their head. And by actually kind of counterintuitively, if you try to do simpler, smaller things, it allows a good programmer to bring their whole genius to it. So we do things like, we never talk about technical debt. We always just have a refactor as you go policy. We've never shut down product development because the code needed to be refactored. We just know that the second time we touch it, we're going to clean things up a little bit. And then the same with the third and the fourth and the fifth time. And meanwhile, if we never touch it again, then we're going to be really thankful that we didn't spend a lot of time in it, over engineering it, because usually if we didn't touch it again, it meant that it didn't matter.
Yep. So that's all really, I think, speaks to your journey that you told us about at the beginning, from, really a self-taught hacker type person to CEO and product creator. And now you're really building out your organization and setting the culture and, figuring these sorts of issues out.
Right. I mean, a lot of it you learn through experience. Although it would be nice if, the Coach Me theory is that you could learn from someone with more experience, so you could accelerate your own learning. And there was definitely some of that in my own career. Good mentors along the way helped me see that there's a better way to do stuff.
Yes, and actually delivering like online mentoring is very, very, very hard.
Yes.
Hard to get right. So it's exciting that you're doing in a sense a version of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as a leader, as a product creator now, what do you feel like is your superpower and your sweet spot? What kind of projects light you up the most?
It's a great question. I struggle with the idea that it's a superpower, but I do know what my sweet spot is, which is I'm very drawn to inventions rather than iterations. Someone on my board is been working in online publishing for a while. He was the founder of Blogger and then Twitter and now Medium. And so, Blogger, I think, was an invention. And then, he's ended up spending a long time there. So that's good for him. But you would never see me go into the blogging space because for me, like you could iterate on it, but it's not a place that requires reinvention. And so I've just always been, even though I started in social networking with the first company, what I saw was a really novel use case for it. I was the first one to sort of created a niche of replacing a conference attendee directory with a social network, which was like, it's very niche and wasn't a great business, but somehow like by the time, we were 2 years old, there was like 10 different companies doing it. But I invented that niche, I think, because that is my sweet spot, is looking for novel approaches. And the same with coaching is a very mature industry, but there's never been a way to do it on demand. And then in seeing how to do it on demand, we saw, in fact, that coaching could be, just one of the main options that, maybe even the dominant option when it comes to training and education. I mean, certainly all things being equal, you would rather learn from an experienced master who's giving you personalized instruction than from a generic class that meant to cover the needs of 100,000 people.
So how does content fit into that model?
Into our model of coaching.
Yes.
In coaching, there's a little bit of a debate about, does the coach teach or do they merely facilitate change within a person? So there's a branch of coaching that feels very strongly that they're not trainers, they are merely there to facilitate change. And I don't buy into that at all. What I'm trying to do is find a way to put coaches in a position where they can be as effective as possible. And what we found as we did coaching online is that the more action-oriented we can get them, the more effective they are. What that means is that you end up having coaches that are less generalized. There's this idea of a life coach, which is like actually kind of crazy sounding, right? That some random person could coach every aspect of not just your life, but anyone's life, right? Like, aren't our lives all so distinct that there would, no one person could fit what I'm trying to do? And so what our coaches end up being much more narrowly focused. So even at the start, our original coaches would be focused on like a specific productivity tactic. Like they would coach you on applying, the Pomodoro method throughout your day. Or there would be on the health side, there might be a coach who wasn't a nutritionist. They were more specific to a particular diet. And so as we've gotten more specific, we made very specific material for that. So example, in our leadership coaching, when we go into a company, we say, okay, the people that get coached are going to not just learn this set of skills. Here's a skill list of what is going to be covered. Not only are they going to learn every skill on this list, they're going to actually apply each of them to their work. But in order to have that skill list, we needed content. And so we actually just finished the first big module for that around meeting mastery, which is a big part of when you're a leader, you're running and facilitating more meetings. And so in order to coach that effectively, we had to write a book. And it wasn't the biggest book in the world, it was about an 80-page book. But that was the key to making that type of coaching really effective.
So did you look at licensing or using somebody's already written book? Or was there nothing appropriate?
We didn't think that there was something exactly appropriate. We felt like we could maybe cobble something together through one of the online book providers. I'm thinking specifically about Safari Books Online, which I'm friendly with the founders there, and I could see some potential to do it. Also, in general, my experience with partnerships is that they're easier to do if you have a template for what you want to do, which I guess this goes against what we were saying earlier about just do it really simple. But we did it without any content beforehand. That was the simple version. And then once we got through that like no content version of the coaching, we were pretty confident in what we were going to need. And it was worth the investment to us, at least, of doing a custom version of it. I expect that once we have this template fully fleshed out and working, that we will be licensing more content down the road.
Cool. So as someone who's drawn to inventions rather than iterations, what are you seeing that's new and exciting on the horizon these days? What trends are you following? What are you paying attention to?
I really like this idea of real world meets tech. I think since I grew up as a programmer, I had this time where my life was fully just tech only. And so you could see a company like the ride sharing app Lyft, which absolutely they had to design an app in order to make that. But then they also designed a rider experience. For a while, the drivers would give you a fist bump, right? Which I'm not saying that I love that. But what I did love is the pink mustache that people were driving around in, because you could tell that was such a great branding idea. And so what you kind of saw product design break out of this mold of like this very narrow, I might build an application, to I might build an experience. And I think when I look at all of the things that go into a product, I really love being able to think about the whole experience. So, it's stuff like, for us, we need to build software. And the thing that makes our software more functional is when the coach's messages are being delivered, as contextually as possible. So like actually you could receive our coaching now inside of Slack. And so that's the kind of the technical aspect of it. But then I have a human who I'm trying to augment their own coaching. And so that's a huge part of the product experience for us, is who are those humans and how were they trained and vetted and hired? And then beyond that, just what is the experience of being a client, of ours? If you have in our leadership coaching, when you start, you're going to have this relationship with a coach, but we're also going to send you the book that we wrote. And then when you complete the leadership program, we're going to give you a Nanodegree and put that on your LinkedIn, right? And so it actually, the whole experience of going through that coaching is much broader than the software that we wrote. And so I'm always on the lookout for companies like that. And then the other one that's really on my mind is this idea of augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. If you ever read about the implementation behind Facebook's Concierge M, which not everyone has access to, but the implementation is that an artificial intelligence is doing a lot of the work, but every message is vetted by a human before it goes out. And I think the same with our coaches is that we really like having a human there, but we see all this potential to augment what they're doing through some smart programming.
What kinds of smart programming?
That's a good question. Because so much of our coaching is text-based, essentially we can do textual analysis. So one thing we found really early on when we were doing coaching is that if a coach was a strong listener, and actually demonstrated it, then they would retain a user 3 times longer. So, sometimes when you're doing data analysis, you're looking for like a 1% or 2% improvement. We found something that was a 200% improvement. So then if you think about that in terms of textual analysis, you can actually see if a coach is about to send a message that doesn't include any of the words that their client just sent to them, then there's a good chance that they are not demonstrating active listening, and that can be flagged. And so that's what I would consider an example of augmented. Or a coach just clued me into how to spot a leading question. So generally, if the second word in a question is you, then you're getting ready to send a leading question. You can kind of see when you know the patterns, maybe not all of the patterns, but there's some patterns that you can spot where you can actually help the coach be more effective, to be better.
Wow. That's fascinating. That could have a lot of different applications.
What I like about it too is it's not that hard, right? Sometimes when you hear about artificial intelligence, it just sounds improbably hard. And I think there's some people that are really drawn to that. But I'm much more pragmatic, and those examples are things that I think, even though I don't write that much code anymore, are within the capabilities of myself as an individual programmer to do. And, certainly within Alicia's capabilities or anyone on our team.
What's on the horizon these days? What's new and exciting for you that's coming up?
We touched on it a little bit. The big idea that we're onto is that education can be replaced by a new format that's 2 orders of magnitude more effective than what we're used to. So if you say the existing format is about getting this depersonalized data dump that's disconnected from application, in a way, like we don't even think, it's rare to think about applying your education. And only occasionally do you get like a class that's titled like applied math, which is, I think people look down on the idea of applied math a lot of times, but I think of it as this like indictment of the rest of the math. It's like, wait, how much math did I learn that I wasn't going to apply? How horrifying is that? How much of my school years was spent learning things that I just have no bearing to my life? So those two things, that the learning is not personalized for you, and then it has no bearing on your real life, I think of those as really, core problems in how we're educated right now. And so the format of coaching that we're working on, which is on-demand coaching where you have access to your coach every day, solves both of those problems. The material can be hand-delivered to you by a coach who's working with you to apply it to your real life, which goes back to an example I gave earlier about, how would you want to get your MBA? Would you want to take 2 years of your life, put your life on hold for 2 years and go to, get a traditional MBA? I mean, let alone the cost of it. I mean, that's a pretty big investment of your time. Or would you rather have, a business professor or a series of business professors even working with you to apply the key skills that you might have learned in your MBA to the actual business that you're trying to build or run? Absolutely. You would rather get it through a coach. That just hadn't been possible before. And so, we're able to scale coaching. And as we incorporate more content into that, I think that we can be, essentially the pinnacle of education. And that's what we're shooting for. Does that seem like it's worth being excited for?
It does seem like it. I mean, I have a lot of questions about it, but I think that you're on the trajectory where you're trying it and you're testing it and you've got real clients and you're learning a lot, which I think is the through line of this interview.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really cool to know more about it. And I'm so excited to see where you take Coach.me and what you learn from it and what direction it grows in. So I so appreciate your time today. And thank you so much for sharing your stories and your hard-won lessons and all your wisdom with us.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. I love talking to you. I always like talking to you under any format. It doesn't need to be recorded, although, it's definitely an honor that you felt like this one needed to be.
Thanks for listening to Getting to Alpha with Amy Jo Kim, the shows that help you innovate faster and smarter. Be sure to check out our website, gettingtoalpha.com. That's getting2alpha.com for more great resources and podcast episodes.